Welcome, everybody. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I only hear one yes, so maybe it's just one person.
Yes, we all have to unmute ourselves.
Yes. Thank you so much. I'm actually going to be mean, and I'm going to mute everybody just because there's a lot of people that's tuning in right now. So let me just do that really quick. You all, okay. Perfect. Everyone can hear me. You can give me a thumbs up if you want. Awesome. Okay. Well, welcome. Welcome to Words with Wine. My name is Matt Brown. I'm the Director of Admissions and Financial Aid at St. Bernard School of Theology and Ministry. And I am incredibly excited to have the opportunity to introduce tonight's presenter, an adjunct instructor of ours, Siobhan Maloney, who I just previously joked around with her. I'm going to let everyone know that the classes she taught in the summer, I think, brought in over 50 people. And most of those people were brand new to St. Bernard. So that was a class on Tolkien that she taught in the summer. It was very, very good. So I just want to kind of give a rundown of the agenda and what is planned for today. I'm doing the welcome right now. There's going to be a prayer and a small toast. At around 7:35, so a few minutes, I'm going to introduce our brand new Registrar and Coordinator of Development, Sophia Zanowski. And then there's going to be a small video presentation of one of our sponsors, of the Abbey of New Clairvaux. Usually they'll be able to be here to represent and to talk a little bit about the Vineyard and the Abbey, but they can't be here. So I'm going to be playing, in lieu of that, I'll be playing a small video. And then, of course, I'll be introducing Siobhan Maloney on her presentation on By Niggle by J.R.R. Tolkien, discussion, and then a small conclusion, and, of course, an invitation for our next Words with Wine on Thursday, September 17th. We've yet to come up with a theme or a topic or a speaker, but please, watch out, watch our Facebook account and our Instagram and our website. So we will be posting that news as soon as we know. Second here. Alrighty. As I said, before we begin, I'd like to begin this evening with a prayer. And if we may, if we can say the Hail Mary prayer together. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you. I would also like, because I hope everybody is prepared for the wine, if I can say a quick toast. I would like to give a toast. Let's see everyone's wine here. There we go. Get them up there. I want to toast especially in thanks for the partnership with New Clairvaux Vineyards and the wine that they have provided us. Let's toast to the opportunity of just being here together in community and thanking God for the technological advances that allow us to be here together during these crazy times. Cheers. Thank you, everybody. So as I said, so we have New Clairvaux Vineyard and the Abbey as a sponsor, but I'm also, we're also sponsoring this event. Like I said, I'm the Director of Admissions at St. Bernard School of Theology and Ministry. And I would like to speak just about a few points about this fine institution that I'm very blessed to work for. If I can go over here, perfect. These are just a few key points of information about St. Bernard's, but we are a Catholic graduate school located in upstate New York. We have physical campuses in Rochester and Albany, and we just got into the Buffalo area as well. We just started to train their diaconate candidates for this upcoming year. Though we have these physical campuses, we serve students all over the country. Every single one of our degree programs and certificates can be 100% completed via distance learning, okay? And that is all synchronous and asynchronous via Zoom. We're very, very blessed. And, it's obviously there's a lot of pain and suffering with COVID. But one of the things the positive things anyways, is that we were, as an institution, in a way very, very prepared for this, because we can do all of this via Zoom, just like what we're doing right now. So it's a complete blessing that we are able to connect with people that, we haven't been able to meet physically, and really, stretch our message across the country. It's fantastic. St. Bernard's, just a little bit of a history. We used to be a seminary in the 1800s in Rochester, a Catholic seminary that trained priests. In fact, our former Bishop of Rochester and Chancellor of St. Bernard's was Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen, which is a fantastic thing. It's very, very cool. So we like to point that out as well. This is a really big week for us institutionally, anyways, because we just officially launched our brand new certificate programs. So if you are interested in going deeper on an aspect of your faith without having to commit to a full degree program, again, these can be completed all online. Please seriously consider these certificate programs. So we have 4 currently: certificate in Catholicism and Fine Arts. So for those that have been really loving Words with Wine, that could be right up your alley as well. A certificate in Catholic Philosophy, a certificate in Catholic Bioethics, and a certificate in Catechetical Leadership. And we just launched this. And if you have any questions about that, again, I'm the Director of Admissions. I'm going to put my email in the chat box. Please don't hesitate to ask any questions, okay? Again, if you have any questions about our graduate programs, certificate programs, or maybe you just want to take a class for credit or just audit a class, you can do that too. Please contact me. Quickly, before we move on, small plug for Siobhan Maloney's fiance. He's going to be teaching a class. He's an adjunct with us, Apolangio Latar. He's teaching a class called The Whole Breadth of Reason, Faith, Science, and Technology this semester. So that's going to be really cool. And keep in mind, too, that there are scholarships and financial aid available for anybody that's enrolled in a graduate program or even just taking a course as a non-matriculated student. So that's St. Bernard's in 2 minutes, and there's so much more to talk about. But before I move on, I'd like to quickly introduce our new coordinator of development, Sophia Zanowski, if you can say a few words. Yes. If you can find yourself and how to unmute yourself here.
I'm here.
There you go.
I'm here. I found the mute button. So like Matt Brown said, my name is Sophia Zanowski. I'm the new coordinator of development, registrar, and assistant to the dean. And I've been in this position, or really these positions, for I think it's almost 7 going on 8 weeks. So it's crazy how time flies. The last time I hadn't yet unpacked my wine glasses. So that's very exciting that we're making improvements there. And we are in the thick of preparing for our fall semester and our academic year to start, which is exactly 1 week from tonight, actually. Our first class of the semester starts. And so it's been a really exciting time to join St. Bernard's. Of course, preparing for any new academic year is always exciting and challenging. But I think this year we've definitely been feeling how different it is with, how many unique challenges the pandemic has thrown at our students and thrown at us. So it's been quite a whirlwind of a summer, but I think we're going to get through it. We're really excited. We're really excited for some of the changes on the horizon. And so because of these challenges and kind of a wonderful blend of both sides of my job, we have decided to launch a COVID relief campaign. And I'm going to share my screen really quickly. On our homepage here, stbernards.edu, right in the top right-hand corner, there's a page for giving. And we've decided to launch this campaign to help see our institution and our students through these challenging times, of course, by the grace of God. And so if you feel so inclined to give to this campaign in any way, in any amount, we would be very, very thankful for that. I was talking to our dean, Matthew Cooner, saying, we always pray for our donors, but now especially, we're really, really feeling that donor base, and we're very thankful for how much support we have far and wide for our institution. I also wanted to say quickly that if you did donate when you registered, of course, Words with Wine is free for anyone, anywhere, thanks to technology. But if you did donate optionally when you registered for this event, it'll go to that fund. And so I wanted to thank anyone who donated when they registered. And I think that's all I have. So I'm going to pass it back to Matt Brown.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I really appreciate that. That's beautiful. All righty. Perfect. So I want to also play a video for you. This is a small video of the Abbey of New Clairvaux, and in lieu of them not being able to be here, I want to just kind of play sort of the mission and show the mission video of what they do.
And unable to support the monks' vision.
It seems like we're having some issues with the sound, so I'm going to give some commentary while we're watching this video. We have this very, very unique, exciting partnership with the Abbey of New Clairvaux, which is located in California. St. Bernard of New Clairvaux. We have the Abbey of New Clairvaux.
The self-sustaining monastery.
So sorry, guys.
Spiritual setting.
There we go.
Brown. Now we can hear you.
It would not. It wouldn't get off my screen. I know I saw chats. I think Liz had mentioned that. Could anybody hear that at all?
No.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'm Matt Brown. I was just saying that because we have named after St. Bernard of New Clairvaux, we partnered with the Abbey of New Clairvaux when we started this virtual series, Words with Wine. They're by a community of Cistercian monks. St. Bernard was a Cistercian, so we share a mission with them there. So they help sponsor this series, this virtual series, which is a blessing of the times, really, that we can partner with an Abbey all the way out in California to digitally do events, and we're located in New York and we have people from all across the country. So we've really loved this partnership, and we are working on ways that we can actually take that further and we have a couple exciting collaborations in the works. So of course, you all as attendees of Words with Wine will be the first people that we will alert when we're kind of ready to launch those partnerships. Usually we have a brother who's able to join us and speak on the Abbey, but they have just started their harvest, which is they are absolutely swamped. I mean, the way they talked about it's like morning to night, dusk to dawn, they are harvesting these grapes because it's peak time. They have like a very short window to harvest and make the wine. So that's why they couldn't join us tonight.
Thank you so much, Sophia. So that is called thinking on your feet when the audio goes wrong right there. So that's why we hired her 6 or 7 weeks ago. Thank you so much. I do apologize for that. The video is beautiful. You can just literally go to YouTube, type in New Clairvaux Vineyard, and it would pop right up. So just keep that in mind. Thank you so much, Sophia. All righty. So for the reason why we're all here, I'm going to introduce our presenter, Siobhan Maloney, who will be doing a presentation on the classics and faith leaf by Niggle, it was written by J.R.R. Tolkien. So we're very, very excited. Siobhan Maloney studied humanities and Catholic culture at Franciscan University and received her master's in theological studies and a licentiate in sacred theology from the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies in Marriage and Family in Washington, D.C. She is currently a doctoral candidate at the Institute, working on her dissertation on the Scottish writer and theologian, one of my personal favorites, George MacDonald. Her licence thesis was entitled Light from an Invisible Lamp, the Sacramental Vocation of the Artist, according to J.R.R. Tolkien. Her work and interests include philosophy, church history, the intersection of art, literature, and theology, and the sanctity of work and the lay vocation. Please help me welcome Siobhan Maloney.
Thank you, Matt. I'm happy to be here tonight to share this with all of you. And I recognize a few familiar faces from the class. So I'm counting on you guys to contribute to our discussion, because this is not the first time you've thought of this story or Tolkien. So looking forward to that as well. For those of you who aren't familiar with Tolkien himself, I just wanted to start with a little background on him and his life. He was a Catholic author British Catholic author. He was born in 1892 and died in 1973. He was born in South Africa. Both his parents were British. And by the age of 12, he had lost both his parents. His father died when he was 3, and his mother died of complications from diabetes before they knew how to cure that. When he was 12. So by the age of 12, he was without both his parents. And the rest of his life, he and his brother were taken in by the Catholic priest, Father Francis Morgan, who was actually at John Henry Newman's oratory. So he was of the same community as Newman. And he grew up very much surrounded by the charism of Newman and the priest there at the oratory. He also fought in World War I. Experienced the horrors of that war, and then his son ended up fighting also in World War II. So he lived through both world wars, suffered on both a personal level and then culturally through some of the hardest events of recent centuries. Both of these things, I think, if you read Tolkien, really, it's clear that both on the cultural level and on the personal level, he was deeply influenced by these events. And so he knew suffering on a deep level. He knew the deep levels of human longing and need on a very personal level. And it's really reflected, I think, in a lot of his work. He was also deeply Catholic, both because of his mother's conversion to Catholicism and the way that she gave the faith, passed on the faith to him and his brother, but then also because of his close relationship with Father Francis Morgan and the other priests there. His faith was always very important and very significant to him in his life. I bring that point up too, because if we're familiar with Tolkien at all, we're probably familiar with the fact that he wrote fiction and fantasy. He's most known for writing The Lord of the Rings, for example, which if you don't even know from the books, at least the movies, most people have at least seen those and know the story. So on face value, maybe the fact that Tolkien was even a Catholic is not something we're as familiar with hearing about him in his life. And his actual occupation was a professor of English literature and language. So his being a writer and his writing fiction and fantasy particularly was a side occupation for him when he wasn't teaching and lecturing on English itself. So I wanted to start with this quote of his because Tolkien is a very interesting figure for the fact that he was a Catholic artist and author of such a recent period, right, who lived through these major events and had a way of incorporating his Catholic faith and his beliefs, not necessarily explicitly, right, but implicitly into his work as a writer. He wrote fantasy primarily, I think, largely because of what he tells us in this quote here. I believe that legends and myths are largely made of truth, and indeed present aspects of it that can only be received in this mode. This, I think, encapsulates why Tolkien decided to write fantasy, right? He decided to write in the mythic mode rather than just any kind of literature. And so before we launch into Leaf by Niggle specifically, I wanted to share with you guys 3 characteristics that Tolkien identified as essential to good literary writing in general, but then particularly to fantasy. Because he was so convinced that the purpose of the artist is to show forth something true and good and beautiful in the world, right? The fact that he says there's an aspect of this truth that only myth and legend can adequately portray kind of reveals why he focused on fantasy. So the first of these points is recovery. And recovery for Tolkien is one thing that all good literary art should present and should portray. And what he means by recovery is encapsulated in these two quotes of his here. He says, "We need recovery. We should look at green again and be startled anew, but not blinded by blue and yellow and red. We should meet the centaur and the dragon, and then perhaps suddenly behold, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs and horses and wolves. This recovery fairy stories help us to make. In that sense, only a taste for them may make us or keep us childlike." Right, so for him, part of recovery is learning to recognize anew things that we have become familiar with, things that we experience in our everyday lives, things that we know very well, right, and that we lose sight of because they're so familiar to us. So kind of encapsulating that a little bit more deeply, he says, recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need in any case to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. Of all faces, those of our familiars are the ones most difficult really to see with fresh attention, perceiving their likeness and unlikeness, that they are faces and yet unique faces. This triteness is really the penalty of appropriation. The things that are trite, or in a bad sense familiar, are the things that we have appropriated. So one of the things Tolkien says that literary art should be focused on, right, is of overcoming this temptation we have, in a sense, to become so familiar with the everyday things, even the people, right, the faces that we're familiar with, in such a way that we lose their significance. We lose the depth and the wonder and the beauty of reality because it becomes familiar. So one of the things that he says good literary art ought to do is help us recover anew the things that are familiar to us. And the second point then is the other side of the same coin in some sense, right? It is in order to recover what is most real and most true of the things we encounter on a daily basis, we have to escape from a false sense of these things. So escape in this sense for Tolkien is a positive thing, and it's one of the things that good literary art helps us to do. And what is it in Tolkien's sense then that we're escaping from? It would be the fallen aspects of our experience, right? The evil and the sinfulness that invade necessarily our fallen condition in this world. The things that we suffer from, right? Also our own temptations that tend to blind us. The false realities that we surround ourselves with, the denial that we tend to live in that help cloud our vision of the real, right? So escape for him is very intimately tied up then with recovery. This is one of the ways that he explains the fairy tale, particularly how it helps us in this manner of escape. He says, fairy represents at its weakest a breaking out, at least in mind, from the iron ring of the familiar. Still more from the adamantine ring of belief that the familiar is known, possessed, controlled, and so ultimately all that is worth being considered. A constant awareness of a world beyond these rings. More strongly, it represents love. That is, a love and respect for all things, inanimate and animate, an unpossessive love of them as other. Things seen in its light will be respected, and they will also appear delightful, beautiful, wonderful, even glorious. So this is similarly to recovery, right? It's another aspect of this recovery. What he's pointing to here is this sense of being able to re-encounter what is most deep and true and beautiful about things because we recognize them in their fullness. We've recognized our own separation from them, the natural distance there. And the third one is consolation. For this, he actually coined his own phrase called eucatastrophe, which captures for him, as he describes here, The sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears. It produces its peculiar effect because it is a sudden glimpse of truth. Your whole nature chained in a material cause and effect, the chain of death, feels a sudden relief, as if a major limb out of joint had suddenly snapped back. This is indeed how things really do work in the great world for which our nature is made. So consolation for Tolkien is the third element that a true literary art will portray. And it's this sense, it's at this level of consolation that he says is a particularly Christian concept, right? That there is finally a hope beyond the limitations and the sinfulness and the fallenness of our experience here, right? That it's the hope of eternity. It's the hope of the resurrection, ultimately. And he will call the resurrection the truest eucatastrophe, right? The eucatastrophe that that all other eucatastrophes, in a sense, in literature can be named after. In that sense, the resurrection is the truest eucatastrophe. This sudden turn that brings victory and joy and resolution unlooked for, right, when everything looked darkest and most hopeless. So these are the three things for Tolkien that every literary art ought to portray, right? It's the task of good literary art to help us enter into these three experiences, right? And for him, fantasy does this most particularly. It does it most fully because it allows us to recover things more deeply by removing us from what is familiar. So fantasy is all about a secondary world, right? It's all about fantastical things that we actually don't encounter on a daily basis. So paradoxically, by normal everyday things like the sun and trees and flowers and animals and bread and wine, he says, all of these normal everyday experiences, by putting them in a new setting, in a fantastical setting that we don't encounter them in, it allows this recovery in a very unique and particular way for us. And then likewise escape, right? Because the context of fantasy is set up so differently than everything we experience on a daily basis. It allows us to enter into this experience of escape and recovery more deeply. And then for him too, similarly, right, again, because it's a new world, it's a different context than our everyday life, these moments of eucatastrophe can be more explicit, can be more extreme, can be entered into more deeply, right? So those are the reasons why for him, fantasy holds a particular pride of place, if in a way, in literary art in general, for him. But I think it's important to remember as we look now and kind of move into this Leaf by Niggle story that there's a connection, that this does not mean for Tolkien that fantasy doesn't have to do with real life or with our lives or with reality and with this world. For him, they're intimately tied together, right? And the purpose of fantasy, the purpose of literary art in general, at the end of the day, through this recovery and escape and consolation, has the purpose of giving us new eyes to see our own lives, our real reality, the world we actually live in, right? The goal in the end is to bring us back to what is real, to our world, to a deeper understanding and appreciation for the creation that we do live in. And I think that I wanted to kind of leave us with that, with this quote here, because it helps to capture that sense for Tolkien. He says, story, fantasy still go on and should go on. The evangelium, the good news of Christ and the resurrection, has not abrogated legends, it has hallowed them. The Christian has still to work with mind as well as body, to suffer, hope, and die. But he may now perceive that all his bents and faculties have a purpose which can be redeemed. So great is the bounty with which he has been treated, that in fantasy he may actually assist in the affiliation and multiple enrichment of creation. All tales may come true, and yet at the last redeemed, they may be as like and as unlike the forms that we give them, as man, finally redeemed, will be like and unlike the fallen that we know. I wanted to have this quote in mind as we look at Leaf by Niggle together, because as we'll see, and I hope we'll be able to discuss somewhat, Leaf by Niggle is a story, right? It's a narrative. It's not presented to us as reality, right? Or necessarily happening within our own world, even in a sense. And yet I think there's so much in that story to reflect on about the relationship between between art and our lives, right? Between this task of being an artist, of being a writer, and the everyday struggle of living our lives, as Tolkien demonstrates here. So just to kind of keep those two worlds in mind as we look at Leaf by Niggle together. The story itself is a short story. Tolkien didn't write many short stories. It wasn't his favorite. He said they didn't usually come to him readily. But Leaf by Niggle would be the exception to that. It was written during World War II, and while he was in the midst of writing The Lord of the Rings. He was actually, as he said in a few letters, stuck in his writing of The Lord of the Rings. He was kind of, he got to a point where everything wasn't working. He couldn't keep going. He was having no inspiration. His son was fighting in the war, and he was very worried about him and about the conflicts that were happening and about the state of England at the time. And there was a lot of pressure involved. So he was kind of at a stuck point in his own work. And he says he woke up one morning with the entire story in his head and sat and wrote it down in a few hours and did very little to it after that. So it was actually published in 1945. And Tolkien himself calls it a purgatorial story. I want to leave that as an open question and see maybe what your own thoughts are about why he would call it that, right? Or what the significance is of him giving it that kind of description. But he says in various letters that the story was the only thing I have ever done which cost me absolutely no pains at all. I woke up one morning with it in my head, scribbled it down. I find it still quite moving when I reread it. In another place, he'll admit that there's an autobiographical sense to the story, right? That he had in mind, particularly in writing Leaf by Niggle, both this tree that he loved outside his bedroom window that was being threatened by the neighbor to be cut down, and reflecting on the significance of that, and also this weight of being stuck in his own work and wondering if it would ever be finished, if it would be this unending corpus of books that would just never find its completion. So both of those things kind of give us an insight into what was in his mind when he was writing the story, or when he put it down. And given that, I wanted to start, this is a question we don't have to necessarily start with, but I want to keep this in mind as we go, given what we I know I did it very quickly, but what we just laid out about these 3 points of recovery, escape, and consolation. As we kind of explore together some of the main themes that come up in this story, I want to reflect on where, to take Tolkien at his word and to ask where in this story, if anywhere, do we see these 3 aspects? Do we experience them? And this, I think, so I put it here first to kind of keep in mind as we go through the rest of the themes, because I know it's been a while. I don't know when all of you actually read the story, if for the first time recently or if multiple times, but just to try to ask yourselves and think of yourselves, where did you experience those things, if you did, in this story? Where did you experience that sense of things that were familiar, taking on a new meaning and a new significance, or being recovered for you, right, in the introduction of the story? Or where did you experience the story as an escape from, right, maybe the limitations and the places that we get stuck in ourselves? And then where might there have been eucatastrophe moments in this story, that surprising turn that you weren't expecting, as we go. But one of the first themes that I want to explore in this story itself is how Niggle as an artist is presented by Tolkien, right? What do we see in this story? Niggle is a painter primarily, right? But what do we see from the presentation of Niggle? What kind of artist is he? How does he relate to his work? How does he approach his art? And what is the relationship between his art and his life as portrayed by Tolkien in this story? Yeah, so if there's any thoughts or reflections on that.
This is time for some discussion too. So if you do want to say something, you should be able to unmute yourselves. So feel free to do that.
Okay, I'll have a stab at it, Siobhan.
Thank you, Liz.
Go ahead.
So his relationship with his work, I think it's kind of like a love-hate thing. He wants to throw himself 100% into it, but he never feels he can because he has all these interruptions in his life. So I think that's true for all of us. Sometimes we want to throw ourselves completely into things, but you have to eat and sleep and shop and take care of people and do your work. And sometimes they compete for your time. You only have limited time. And then what is the relationship between his art and his life? It seems to be all encompassing. And the thing that struck me is he thinks it's, he's so good at it and he's creating this masterpiece. And I think we all think what we're doing is so important, but in reality, it's very small and insignificant. And really, in the end, he really could only paint a leaf, and that's all that's saved. So I think it reminds us of our smallness, and we think we are doing a lot more than we really are, and we're better than we really are.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, listening to you too, I should have maybe incorporate this as well, just as a refresher to kind of have the overview in our head. So the way the story is laid out for us, right, we start with the introduction to Niggle. We're told that he's a painter. He's working on this giant creation of this tree that is his like life's work, right, that he kind of forgets all other paintings to be able to finish it. He has this neighbor named Parrish, right, and throughout the course of the beginning of the story, there's a lot of tension. He's constantly being asked to help his neighbor Parrish with things, and that's distracting him and taking him away from his work. So he's really resentful of this, right? And then his work is interrupted by this journey he needs to take. So he never ends up finishing his tree. And there's some interesting things we can talk about this journey too that he has to go on, right? And it becomes this period of preparation, and there's different stages he goes through to improve himself once he goes on his journey. Until he gets to the point where he discovers his work of art, his tree, right, actually made real in front of him. And that's when he is introduced to his neighbor Parrish, and it gives them the chance to work together on perfecting this work of art that is now real. That was Niggle's to begin with. And the story ends back in the world that Niggle left, right, with this sense of he has been forgotten, his work has been largely forgotten. And as Liz pointed out to us here, all that's left in the end of his work is this leaf in the world itself. And so that's an interesting thing to see how Tolkien ends that. But that's still just a brief kind of recap of the storyline and how we follow through things here. There's just in the very beginning of the story, a quote I wanted to draw attention to was when we're first introduced to Niggle. Tolkien tells us he was the sort of painter who can paint leaves better than trees. He used to spend a long time on a single leaf, trying to catch its shape and its sheen and the glistening of dewdrops on its edges. Yet he wanted to paint a whole tree, with all of its leaves in the same style and all of them different. So he has this tension from the beginning, as Liz pointed out, between his life and his work, and maybe thinking himself and his work more important than it actually is in some levels. But he also is very attentive to detail. He takes his work very seriously. He's more involved in doing it well than necessarily finishing in the end even. So he's so attentive to all the details that he gets stuck spending all this time on one leaf because he wants it to be perfect. So that's an interesting aspect on how Niggle approaches his art primarily. Any other thoughts and or questions on this aspect of Niggle as the artist?
Hello. Hi. It seems like he's introduced as a painter, and that's kind of his job, his identity, but we don't ever really see him painting as a job or earning any money by painting. And he's almost kind of described as an amateur. And half the time, I at least got the feeling like, should he even be painting at all? Is this a good use of his time? And I think the story kind of wanted us to ask that and maybe think in one direction only to show us that it was worth his time. But I think through the story, it's ambiguous as to whether he should actually be painting or should actually be out doing all these other things he's supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to bring attention to as well, right? That it's this also kind of pertains to what Liz was saying. It isn't clear to us from the beginning if this is like an official job of Niggle's, right, or if it's just a pastime of his, because it is from the beginning portrayed in this tension to these other things that are drawing or that are needed on his time. And yet the other things that interrupt his painting are also kind of ambiguous, right? It's Parrish needing sometimes very silly things from him that also kind of make us as the readers want to ask, I mean, does Parrish really need that? Why is he really bothering Niggle over this thing? So there's this ambiguity on both sides of where is Niggle's actual task? What should he be focusing primarily on here? And I think that's intentional because it develops itself through the story, right? Or, I mean, what are, yeah, let's delve into that a little bit more deeply too. What could be the purpose of that tension? And how did you understand what Tolkien was communicating with that tension between his art and these demands of his life that break into that?
I think Niggle saw himself as an artist and what he was doing, but Parrish didn't even recognize the painting every time he came in. He didn't even recognize what he was working on. Almost like, if he really truly was that artist and it was so fabulous, Parrish may have walked in and said, wow, that's beautiful. What are you doing? But he never even paid attention to it. So it's almost just like he wasn't that artist that he thought he was. Because even just the normal neighbor next door didn't even give it a second thought.
Yeah.
The other thing about Niggle is that he had this great vision. I mean, I think he had a greater vision than he had a talent. And he kind of saw like into the great potential of this leaf becoming a big tree and beyond it, the mountain, and he really had that vision, that glimpse of, something beyond.
Yeah, and we see that fulfilled for him right throughout. It's something, the vision that he has that he can't even adequately capture in his work, no matter how hard he tries. It's something that's beyond even his capacity or his ability to enact. Yeah, for sure. Any other thoughts on this? Let's move to the next theme, and if there's further reflections on the art aspect, we can bring that up as well. But I want to look more also at the relationship between Niggle and Parrish, because we see this develop throughout their period together, and kind of, I guess, in light of this, to also reflect on Niggle's journey, right? I know because Tolkien himself termed the story a purgatorial story, right? I think it's safe to assume that what he's portraying in this journey of Niggle's is really his death, right? And he goes through this period of purification, in a sense, after his life. And there's different stages to it. And I think it's really interesting if you follow through, what are some of the first things that Niggle learns that kind of change then how his second encounter with Parrish goes, right? What changes in Niggle during this period of purification when he's in the workhouse, before he is moved to where he discovers his tree, right? Because we have this relationship of Niggle and Parrish in the beginning, in which, as we've been saying, there's a lot of tension and they're at odds. Parrish doesn't even recognize Niggle's work. Niggle is always resentfully helping Parrish and just feeling like he's taking him away from his main job and vocation, in a sense, right? But then Niggle goes on his journey and he goes through this period of purification. So what are some of the the aspects that come out to us. What is the change that Niggle undergoes before his second encounter with Parrish?
Well, while he was in the workhouse, basically it said that time stood still, that, it gave him the chance to really see that, be purified and come to light, that, when he did hear the voices talk about, him and his friend, that he cared about his friend, what would happen to his friend, because he heard that he was in the same spot when he was about ready to get moved on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. The first time we hear any concern on Niggle's part for Parrish, right, when he's thinking about Parrish's good and not just his painting, is actually when he's in the workhouse after he's gone through this period of purification. So I think that's a very significant moment that's the first time we see him kind of advocating for Parrish and looking out for him and concerned for him. Any other reflections on that?
He becomes less self-centered in the sense that he can't really think about himself. He's got to think about his work. He's got to do this horrible job. And it just kind of takes all the ego out. And he ends up, really thinking about Parrish and just doing his work,
Yeah.
Which is a great thing to happen. Yeah.
It was interesting. I thought that the things that were good in Niggle, his vision of nature as it was, and his willingness to help Parrish, even if it annoyed him and he didn't want to, they were kind of kernels in his real life, or not his real life, in his first life. And those kernels were there, but they became clarified and grew into the full version. Not just the art, which was the basis for his second stage after the workhouse, but also his friendship, or his willingness to tolerate Parrish, turned into an actual friendship with Parrish, where he began to value what Parrish valued, and Parrish began to value what he valued, and then they then formed each other in a way in this new vision. So I liked that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that Tolkien tells us specifically how his relationship with his work changed in the workhouse, right? He's doing apparent things now that he doesn't even know the purpose of, but in the process, he starts feeling this satisfaction, he tells us, about his tasks that is new for him. And he says he could take up a task the moment one bell rang and lay it aside promptly the moment the next one went, all tidy and ready to be continued at the right time. He also tells us he was quieter inside now, and at resting time he could really rest. There's a sense of discipline and his previous attention to his work. He now has this sense of satisfaction, of peace, of order, and of structure that comes naturally to him. That doesn't seem at all something that Niggle had previously. And it seems to grow for him. There's this detachment from his work, right? He's content to do what's asked of him, to do it well, to let it go at the moment he needs to let it go. And I think that's kind of, as you're saying this, it was this sense of a more right order to his work, the lack of selfishness there, that opened him to be able to be more a more authentic friend to Parrish, to also recognize the good in Parrish's gifts as well. We see then when he finds his tree, right, and he actually sees Parrish again, one of his first thoughts is that he needs him. The first sense that he gets is that he wishes Parrish was there. He recognizes that Parrish could help him with things, could know things about about nature that he doesn't, and that he could learn from. So there's this openness that we didn't see before in him to the gifts that the unique gifts that Parrish brings too, right? Anyone else on this shift here?
Well, Siobhan, I'll just add one thing, that I think after the voices, Niggle actually asks, how is Parrish? And so he shows his genuine concern, like, can you fix his leg? Can you help him? So it shows he did have this heart that they talked about at the beginning, that he always wished his heart was hardened a little bit. So he did have like a tender spot for people, even though he thought they were annoying because they were interfering with his work. But then he comes to see that those were all the things that helped him get to where he was. So they were sort of each other's road to heaven in a way, is how it appeared to me.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I mean, with that in mind, one of my favorite things on this subject is when Niggle first encounters his tree, right, in real life. His response to discovering that his art, right, has been made real in front of him. One of the descriptions we get there as he's examining this tree is, the one aspect is his response is, it's a gift, right? It's so much more than what he himself could do on his own. And it's interesting that Tolkien also says that it's the tree as he imagined it, not as he actually painted it, right? So it's the tree, all the pieces that he wished he could do, that he had in his mind and was always unable to actually realize. And then he says, in examining all the leaves, and as he recognizes the leaves, right, as he had them in his mind, he also tells us here that the leaves are there as he had imagined them rather than as he had made them. And then he says that the leaves themselves, they were dated as clear as a calendar. Some of the most beautiful and the most characteristic, the most perfect examples of the Niggle style were seen to have been produced in collaboration with Mr. Parrish. There was no other way of putting it. I think if we read that interesting remark in light of earlier in the story when he's on his way to fetch the doctor for Mr. Parrish's wife, right? And Tolkien tells us as he's riding his bike, he has all these inspirations in his mind of what he could do on the tree if only he was right in front of it, right? And this frustration that all of his good ideas come when he's busy helping other people and he can't actually work on the tree. And we're told when he finally gets back to the tree that night, right, he sits there and he has no inspiration and nothing in his mind and he can get nothing done. So if you have that in mind and then you read this, it becomes really interesting to see that it's, in some sense, it seems what Tolkien is pointing to is that Niggle's actual fulfillment of his work, of his art, was the fruit of precisely those moments when he let go of his work and his art in order to help his neighbor in his need, right? That the deepest source of his inspiration was actually the fruit of his moments of self-sacrifice, right? The moments when he put his neighbor first, when he responded to Mr. Parrish's needs. So much so that when the tree is actually fulfilled and given to him, he recognizes in it each of those moments when he actually stopped and helped Mr. Parrish, right? Mr. Parrish, those moments of collaboration with Mr. Parrish are written all over the fulfillment of the tree. That's something that I think that always really struck me about it. Any other thoughts or reflections on this? Maybe also along those lines, how does Tolkien portray then when Parrish and Niggle are together again and working on the tree? What does that look like, or how do they actually help one another?
I think it's a time where they begin to start working together and they start building on their own strengths. and they actually find that they can work together and be friends. And that's about where they start to find joy together, as previously didn't want to have time for each other. But now that they saw that there was something good in each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're told also because of that, right, that it's actually Parrish that spends more time wandering around looking at the beauty of everything, mm-hmm. right? And it's Niggle that spends more time actually actively at work in the gardens, which would have been the opposite of how they were in life, right? Parrish was the one who was attentive to his garden and couldn't be bothered or have time for just experiencing the beauty of things. So in a sense, they also take on the gifts of the other, or learn from the gifts that the other came with, to build on the foundation they had to in the first place.
And then there's the spring. So they would have the tonic that they would put into the spring water, which of course, just sort of brings up like the grace of the Holy Spirit, whatever, that supernatural aspect was at play there too.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not unrelated. If we move to the next theme, I mean, all these are they kind of build on each other here, right? And are related to each other. But we've talked a little bit about what Niggle learns already and what is significant about the tree. But what more, I think specifically in light of our the principles that I laid out in the beginning of the recovery and escape and consolation, how do those aspects, or where do you see those, where did you experience those aspects in the story, and where are they at play through Niggle's journey and through this this revelation of his tree in the end, particularly? Any thoughts on that? Or on anything else we've also been saying? You can pick things too that are not, that I haven't highlighted yet.
Is the tree like the parable of the vines in the garden? If one branch is off, the whole tree dies and the whole plant dies. So each leaf, like in the story, and then like each vine and like in the Gospels, is important to the whole system as a whole, and that's what Tolkien and his neighbor learned and used to realize that no one is a island of their own and can really get through life on their own.
Yeah, I think they learn. I mean, they learn a lot from each other, right? And I think that point is really true. That one of the main things we get from the story is that neither of them, they both need the other, right? They need the gifts of the other as part of their growing process, as part of their learning and growing more fully into themselves. And it's not a loss, right? Niggle doesn't just turn into Parrish, and Parrish doesn't just turn into Niggle, right? They keep the uniqueness of themselves and their characters, but the perfection of their own unique character includes the openness and the communion with the other in a really deep and significant way. I think someone put in the comments that Niggle learns self-discipline throughout his journey, right? And that the tree becomes this in being an eternal life project, something that is grown and worked on here on earth in life, and then it still exists and is more beautiful in eternity, in the afterlife. I think that's a really fascinating perspective of the story, right? The very fact that the tree that Niggle encounters is so much beyond everything he could have imagined of his art. It's something he could never have created in this actual life, right? And yet it's still familiar, it's still his in a way, right? He encounters it as a gift. His discovery of it, in many sense, is this kind of eucatastrophe moment, as Tolkien describes. It's something completely unexpected that he never would have foreseen, that he never would have expected to arrive at the end of his journey and find his tree right in real life in front of him, his whole painting in real life in front of him. So it is this unexpected, sudden, astonishing moment, right? In many ways. And yet, in some sense, it's not simply, oh, here's a tree that's so much better than anything you could have imagined or anything you could have painted. It really is Niggle's tree. It still holds that familiarity that, in some sense, just gives back to him a deeper appreciation of his own art, right? Of his own inspiration of what he had intended to do with the tree that he was not able to do in his own life. So I think you could say there's a sense of recovery for Niggle there as well, in that encounter. Yeah, Elise?
And the other thing is that other people would go there now to hit the what is it called? Niggle's parish, and be helped, so that it was also meaningful for other people. Mm-hmm. Which is, kind of it's funny. I thought of the parable of the mustard seed, like the kingdom of heaven. It's just a little thing that just became a great tree. So anyway.
Yeah.
When all of a sudden there's Tompkins and Atkins, I didn't really understand how we've got this narrative going along, and then all of a sudden these two characters are in there. Like no break in chapter or anything. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that might be a fault too of the PDF version. Whoever actually created the PDF. I think because in my printed book that I have, there is like a break in the text, so it does indicate kind of a separation. There's some kind of shift happening. So if that was not in the PDF, then that I'm sure was confusing and is a fault of the PDF version, or the online version. Yeah, so this sudden shift to this Counselor Tompkins and the Atkins conversation is returning to the real world, right, where Niggle and Parrish would have lived. And they're kind of like the local counselors or authorities of their region. And they're now discussing after the fact, right, kind of their reflections on Niggle and his own ridiculousness, right? This is interesting, the way Tolkien enters this into the story at this point, right? What is their basic judgment on there's three people kind of going on there, but what is their basic judgment on Tolkien's, on Niggle's whole life, really? And on himself as a person. Does anyone remember kind of what their judgment is on Niggle, or how do they see Niggle?
Well, the one sees him as totally worthless, and the other guy says, oh, I don't know, he wasn't so bad, I guess, and did feel that he had some value. But I think that they're both, it's really how we can look at people historically and question all the things that they did with their lives, because now we think we're so much bigger and better. That's my take.
Yeah, the other interesting point is that they all knew he was an artist, right? So the one man is trying to argue, he just discovered his leaf was all that was left. It's actually interesting, if you listen carefully to the conversation, what happens to his painting itself of the tree, they take it and they use it to actually fix Parrish's roof, which is also really interesting, right? So I think there's this correlation going on that in the real world, in actual life, Niggle's painting does actually save and help Parrish in the end, right? It preserves his roof. It saves the roof of his neighbor. So there's this direct correlation between Niggle's art physically and what it does for Parrish. And then in the afterlife, right, how Niggle's art, given its reality, also becomes a gift to Parrish, right? Becomes the place in which he finishes his purgatorial journey, the way Niggle did in the workhouse, right? It's not entirely clear whether Parrish spent time in the workhouse either, but there's this growth we see in Parrish that happens in Niggle's country, in Niggle's painting world, that seems to kind of follow the path Niggle took already in the workhouse in some ways. I think you can see that also because at the end, when Niggle is ready to move on and he wants to go to the mountains, right? Parrish isn't ready to go on. He needs to wait for his wife, first off. But that's also the first moment where he actually is told and realizes that he's in Niggle's painting, right? It's not till the very end, after this work that he does, that that's revealed to him of, this is actually, you're here because of Niggle, and you're here, this place that you've been working on is actually Niggle's idea. So I think that's interesting and significant. But there's also a lot that comes up in this question, right, of, I think, of the worth of the artist, the worth of the person who seems to have no usefulness for society, right? That's the argument at the end between these two voices of, well, what did Niggle ever do for anyone? I mean, his painting was useless. It, you know, in the end, it all ends up in the rubbish heap to begin with. He should have, we don't want people like Niggle around. We want the people who can do something useful for society. And there's that one man who's not, he's not entirely sure of that, because he's somehow been so struck by that simple leaf that was all that was left of Niggle's painting. And they just tell us that he can't get it out of his head, right? And eventually even the leaf perishes, we're told. So Tolkien is merciless about, nothing of Niggle is left actually in real life. But I think it's significant that there's still that capacity that just that single leaf ends up making it in the museum, because it struck that man. There was something about the beauty of that leaf that still moved him. And then instead, though, how do we actually what is the ending of the story? So we don't end with this debate of the voices or the usefulness of the art of the artist. We go back to the afterlife for the end. And what is kind of the definitive word then on Niggle and Parrish in this story?
Okay, I did some perseveration on the tree.
Okay.
Because of all the things that trees do and are, I have a favorite tree, and that's where I do some of my meditation. It grew. Actually, a painting of a tree did what a tree does. It made a roof.
Mm.
It sheltered people. Inside the home, people could be who they are, grow, and become useful.
Mm.
So the leaf is what's left, maybe verification of the job, but then even then the leaf disappears. But the tree had served its purpose. Trees are used so often in literature. The Giving Tree, which is the story that we have with kids about the tree that grows up, the kids under it, and at the end he gave it its all to itself. Kathleen Applegate has the Wishing Tree, which is I was going to say later elementary, early middle school book that's now being read about the purposes of a tree and all the things that trees do. So for Niggle to paint the leaf and then have these interruptions and have his art and have a tree, I'll bet it's art, it's flat on paper, it still functions as a tree, not only in showing the growth of Niggle from perseverating on something small to his interruptions and bigger, but to sheltering so much.
Mm.
So I enjoyed the tree as a character in the story.
Yeah.
I think this is an interesting, I think it's interesting to read it maybe as showing some of Tolkien's thoughts on myth and fairy stories. I like the line at the very end that talks about Niggle's parish, the tree, the garden, as being the best introduction to the mountains. Kind of in the way that, I don't know if it was Tolkien who said that, but somebody who said that art may be the only gospel that somebody ever encounters.
Mm-hmm.
But The guy who doesn't like Niggle's art is basically saying it's not useful, it's not posters, it's not propaganda, it's not new and modern and such, it's just old-fashioned. And then you don't even have Niggle's old-fashioned art, you have like a piece of it that's been recovered, which reminds me of like folk and fairy tales being this kind of shadow of myth that's been recovered, but there's still this glimpse of something more in them that prepares people for the mountains or the final vision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's really significant. In some sense, you could say that Tolkien's pointing to a different sense of usefulness, right? That art serves a purpose just as much as these other more practical skills would and do, right? But the purpose that art serves is in some sense much more supernatural. It is in that sense more invisible than our everyday tasks and activities, right? Because art serves, the usefulness of art is, as you're describing, right, is to draw us into something deeper and bigger and greater. It's to help us, as he says, recover, escape, and have the consolation of the larger picture of the story we belong to, right? To reinsert us into these deeper, truer things and what we were ultimately made for. And so in that sense, art is extremely useful, and it serves a purpose that other things can't for us, right? And I think all of us can have experiences of that if we're moved by, I mean, even music more particularly, right, than words per se, or all these, or the visual arts, all these different forms of art that have that capacity to draw us out of ourselves and to kind of reinsert us into the greater reality that we belong to. And it is a different sense of usefulness, right? But it still serves a purpose. And I think in that way, it's beautiful that in the end, we're given the sense that Niggle's art, right, and Parrish's art as a gardener, the two of them together, their skill remains useful for all eternity, right? Their art has this place that serves the purpose of introducing everyone that comes after them, or lots of people that come after them, right? Into the mountains, right? Into actually heaven itself, in a sense, right? That the country that's beyond even this kind of intermediate place that they're going through. So in that sense, there's this Tolkien seems to be making the bold claim that our art even it lasts in eternity in a beautiful sense, that it serves a purpose even beyond our lives, beyond this life in a way, that it is very mysterious in some sense.
Siobhan, you use the word art draws us out, but I see it more as art reveals what is in us. Rather than drawing us out. It's like our insides are on our outside. You can see our outside. You can see the genius of Tolkien because he woke up one morning and there was this story. And this story was in the middle of a writer's block about the rings, and that was his obsession. He is Niggle. He has his obsession. He can see nothing else. And he falls asleep and finally has the interruption of sleep. And he wakes up and his insides are out. His feelings, his vision of art, a discussion of interruptions that gives you the break from art that allows you to be creative later. You know, it's kind of a so multi-leveled story that it's fun to read more than once, just so you know. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's very true. I think anytime we are being artistic, right? It's a sharing of ourselves. It's an opening of what is inside of us, for sure. I think simultaneously, though, like as the experience of someone on the outside receiving the art, right? It draws you out of yourself too to meet the other, right? It draws you beyond yourself to receive what the other is presenting us with. So I think it's this mutual movement. Or maybe maybe what I mean more by drawing us out is that expand, like Tolkien says, we need to clean our windows. It's that expanding of our view by incorporating this other person's view of the world, that maybe each of us can see something more clearly than another. All of us have something unique to share, just like Niggle and Parrish had different skills that the other needed. All of us, in some sense, have something unique that we bring, our own vision and view of things that others ultimately also need, right? That isn't just limited to art, right, for Tolkien. And I think that's one of the things I particularly love about this story, is the way in which, on one level, it's all about art, and it's all about Niggle's art, and it's all about the struggle of being an artist, and always falling short of your inspiration and your desires, and the hope, right, that even in the next world, in the next life, everything you dream about your art will actually be given, right, will actually come to fruition. And I think you hear that desire and that longing of Tolkien's here, right, that even if I don't finish this work of mine in this life, I want to believe in the hope that it will be fulfilled, even that it can be fulfilled, right, in the next life in some mysterious way. But I think at the same time, there's so much in the story just about life, about human life, about even for those of us who don't consider ourselves artists, for example, or who don't think we have any creativity in us, right, that this whole story is a journey. It's also, in some sense, then a journey that we all take. The questions that we all face in our life about the relationship between our work, whether it's our occupations or our hobbies or the things we love, with our duties, right, with the needs of others in our life that are given to us, how we reconcile that, how we live that tension, because it inevitably is a tension in many cases for us. And then how our lives and our choices and our decisions here relate to the next life, right? So this is kind of almost like two planes that I see within this story, between all the questions of the artist and the questions of just the pilgrim, in a sense, right? Just the human pilgrim on this journey, of what that looks like and how we live that. Yeah, so I just kind of want to raise both of those levels here, because I think it's significant that Tolkien is recalling both of them for us. And in that sense, yeah, I mean, I'm curious, if you saw kind of both of those elements, or if you had anyone have any thoughts or reflections on that?
Well, I shouldn't admit, I'm almost hesitant to admit it, but I saw so much of myself in Niggle. I mean, just like, the lack of discipline many times, like, well, I'll do those things for other people, but inside I'm like grumbling or complaining or thinking that it is an interruption. And yeah, it really hit home for me. The whole Niggle's whole predicament. So it's very human.
And also, I found it a very comforting view of purgatory. Like, it took away any kind of pain and suffering that you may hear about purgatory. It was a very gentle approach, like, let's improve where we are weak. Let's just, like, God is helping us to kind of be well-rounded where our lows were low, and then he just brings us up to where we should be. And so to me, it was very comforting, very merciful. It made me not afraid of purgatory.
Yeah. I think the thing that always moves me the most about it is just the mercy of this story, right? The mercy on Niggle's life, just as a person, not even just as an artist, right? The fact that he is met with he has a second chance, right? To learn and to grow, to re-relate to Parrish anew, right? To accept and embrace him and his needs, and to work together. He's given all of his art back in the next life. He's given all of the fruit of his work, the fruit of, in some sense, even he was a very insignificant person. And I can obviously relate to much of him as well, just in that sense of, you know, feeling interrupted by all these things that are normal parts of your life. And he helped Parrish, yes, but it was always grumbling and always resentful. And in the end, in some sense, in spite of him not having deserved any of it, he's given everything he wanted, the fulfillment that he always craved and was without in his life. And it's precisely because of, it's the fruit of even those grudging yeses that he gave to his neighbor, even the imperfection of his attempt to be faithful to what was in front of him in life. So I always get a lot of hope from that and from this story, of that, you know, even the smallest things, our smallest attempts to be selfless and to let go of our ideas of things and to respond to the moment in front of us and to the call that's in front of us in life. In the end, that everything is given back through that moment.
But it almost seems like in his time in purgatory, he had to learn that he had no control over his life. But I think in reflection, he realized that he didn't have control in his prior life either. And when he wanted to have control, he was always miserable because he had to stop and do everything for everybody else. When he finally let go and just helped other people, he found the beauty in it. And he found the beauty in being a friend with Parrish and doing the work that he so hated. He actually enjoyed it in the end because he was open to it and just realized there was no control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Matt, I just want to ask how we are with time.
I'd say 5 more minutes if people have anything else to add.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll just open at this point for questions, any questions or thoughts from the whole of the story.
I'd just like to ask about the voices. If there's any thoughts about those two voices, the first voice and the second voice.
Yeah, I don't have a definitive answer. I mean, one of the marks of Tolkien particularly is that he hated strict allegories. So he intentionally did not want anyone to read into his stories, and he intentionally didn't write his stories in the sense of this thing equals that thing, right? Or this thing stands for that thing. So I think in the spirit of Tolkien, we would want to keep open that the voices represent lots of things. It can signify a lot of things, right? In some sense, on one level, I think they simply represent justice and mercy in some ways, right? It's the one voice is trying to be very, very objective about all of the things that Niggle didn't live up to in his life, and the other voice is always pointing out, oh yes, but what about this and what about that, and we need to keep this in mind, right? And at some point the one voice says, well, that is your job, right, to keep all of these, to advocate in a sense for these people. So there is, in that sense, I mean, maybe in some way you could also think of it, again, I wouldn't be strict about this, but in some sense like the Father and the Son, right? The Son is our advocate. Christ is our advocate to the Father. So in that sense, he's the one who kind of stands as the mediator to argue our case in a sense. So that might be another way of thinking about the voices. But I think he obviously intentionally doesn't name them, and they're just voices, right? Even Niggle doesn't see them and doesn't know entirely who these people are. So yeah, I think that's intentional on his part. Anyone else here?
I have one question. Would you say that grace enters into the story anywhere in perfecting the view of the tree, of seeing his art as he imagined it, and then he actually encounters it in this new place? Would you say that's grace, or what would you say that is?
I think you could call it grace. I mean, in the sense we experience grace is always unearned, right? It's a free gift. It's something that's given gratuitously to us over and above anything. We don't earn grace, right? It's something that is completely given and undeserved. And in that sense, even his exclamation in the face of the tree, right? It's a gift. He experiences this tree as a gift over and beyond anything he ever could have imagined. So yeah, I think in that sense you could say that it's an expression of grace for him, and of grace and of mercy on his life in that way and on his work. I just wanted to end then, if there's no more questions on that, with this quote to share with you guys. It's from a poem by Robert Browning, and I think it really captures how Tolkien approaches art, and his art as a literary writer, and as a writer of fantasy primarily, and helps us to see also, in some sense, as a kind of a final word on Niggle and his life as well, and then ways in which we can continue to live, even if we're not artists, strictly speaking, out of the same sense. I found it just really appropriate to this topic today. And he says in this poem, "For don't you mark, we're made so that we love first when we see them painted, things we have passed perhaps 100 times nor cared to see. And so they are better painted, better to us, which is the same thing. Art was given for that. God uses us to help each other so, lending our minds out." I just wanted to leave everyone with that reflection, and hopefully we can all kind of leave with this question of what ways in our life, even if we don't consider ourselves artists, right? How can we allow our lives to be open, to be signs of beauty and of God and of grace to others in our lives, in ways perhaps to be this image, right? To be, in some sense, an expression of things we do see every day that we become so familiar with we don't recognize anymore. This is what Tolkien wanted to do, and what Niggle hoped to do, right, in his life, and something that I think all of us in our own unique way have a capacity to bring in our own circles and in our own work. So thank you all for sharing the story with me and for your reflections.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. I appreciate that. Just keep in mind, our next Words with Wine is going to be September 17th at 7:30. We don't have a topic or speaker yet, but you will know as soon as we do. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Siobhan.
Thank you, Siobhan.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you guys next time.
Bye-bye.